Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Young, and I am an assistant professor of political science here at University of South Carolina, Aiken, with the political science program. I teach American Government 201 classes, and today in this mini lecture, I will be talking about the Federalist Paper 54, some of the key points in that document, and this should help you in completing your quizzes that are on Blackboard for the module that show REACH Act compliance. So let's get started. So the Federalist 54 is an important document to consider because it talks about one of the most disappointing, painful parts of the Constitution, the Three-Fifths Compromise. And those of you who have probably read about this or learned about it in your government classes, the Three-Fifths Compromise was the clause in the Constitution that was added to settle regional disputes during the drafting regarding how to count the population. So one of the big things that they had decided at the Constitutional Convention is that in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives each state would get was based on the size of the population of the states. The states with bigger population would get more representatives in Congress. The states with smaller populations would get lower representatives in Congress. So this idea of how to count the population, who counts in the population, is very important. And one of the first things that came up from this is the idea of how the enslaved population would be counted. There was a big population of enslaved people in the southern states, much smaller population of enslaved people in the northern states. And so the delegates wanted to figure out, what should one do with the enslaved population? Should they be counted in this total that would determine the number of representatives for each state? Ultimately, we know that what the founders decided with the Three-Fifths Compromise is that they would count the enslaved population at only 3/5 of its full share of the population. So instead of counting all enslaved individuals, essentially the population of enslaved individuals would be counted only at 60% of its share. Doing this ultimately addressed a political quandary, a dilemma between the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, especially those in the North who did not want a larger population of enslaved people counted, and those in the South who did want the larger population of enslaved people counted. So it did address that political quandary between those regional factions at the Constitutional Convention. But ultimately, we know it sacrificed norms of human dignity to do so. Essentially, it was not acknowledging the full value and humanity of enslaved people by its effect. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So let's talk a bit more about the backstory. The author of the Federalist 54 was probably Madison, James Madison. That's the consensus among most historians. It could have been Hamilton, but it was probably James Madison. It's important to note that James Madison himself was a slave holder and slave owner. He's estimated to have owned over 100 slaves at least. So he's writing this from the perspective of somebody who does own slaves. The author takes a sort of detached and forced neutral tone in discussing the Three-Fifths Compromise. He frames it as, our Southern brethren would hold this view, or many of those in the North would hold this view. So he's framing it as he's talking about, well, how would this person view this issue, and how would that person view this issue? He's not necessarily writing it from a first-person perspective. It's important to note that the Southerners wanted the enslaved people to be counted in the population. This might seem a little counterintuitive because certainly we know through history that the Southerners were deeply invested in the institution of slavery, and part of the institution of slavery was regarding those who were regarded as slaves, as property. And so it might seem a little counterintuitive. They actually wanted to count the enslaved population. It was clearly not to give enslaved people the right to vote or the right to be recognized as full citizens, but it was to increase the amount of representation that each individual Southern state could receive in Congress. It's important to note that back in this time, direct taxes, the amount of taxes that the states would pay, were based on counting individuals. They were capita taxes. And that increased the Southern tax liability because the individual enslaved people were also a part of that tax liability. They were a part of that cost. The Southerners were basically saying that if they're having to pay these extra costs and taxes, they also wanted to gain some of the benefits of having enslaved people counted for the purpose of representation, that they wanted to have more representatives in Congress as a result. The author says, in quotes, "Could it reasonably be expected that the Southern states would concur in a system which considered their slaves in some degree as men when burdens were imposed, meaning taxes, but refused to consider them in the same light when advantages were to be conferred, meaning the benefits of representation?" The Northern position was somewhat different. The Northern factions were opposed to counting the enslaved people in the population, and their logic that the author here suggests that the Northern factions give for this is that the population estimates in the South, in those states in the South, they don't even count the enslaved population in their own estimates. So, one thing they say is that the state laws themselves don't recognize or count the enslaved population in these Southern states, or these states that recognize and endorse slavery. They also said that, the enslaved people are not allowed to vote in those states. They're simply not regarded as persons, so under what reasoning should Southerners be able to include them now, simply to drive up their number of representatives in Congress? The author then makes a very provocative statement to muse on the Southern position with a little more depth. He says that the Southerners actually view enslaved individuals as both persons and property, that the Southern state laws do regard, to some degree, enslaved people as persons. But of course, they also regard them as property as well. So, in regard to the property, the recognition of enslaved people as property, they're compelled to labor not for themselves, restrained in their liberty, and degraded from human rank. These are all quotes that come from the document. So in this way, the state laws in the South do not regard enslaved people as people. But then the author also goes on to say that the state laws in the South do hold individual enslaved people accountable for their actions and choices. For instance, they can be prosecuted if they do something wrong. They can be punished if they do something that is wrong. They're regarded by the law in this way as a member of society, quote, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. So you get this really interesting position that, in some ways, enslaved people are regarded just as property, but then in other ways they're also regarded as having some moral agency, being people in some regard. What's interesting about all of this, of course, is that both the Northern and the Southern positions are being given voice, those delegates. The author of this Federalist Paper is able to say, well, I can see it from this person's side and I can see it from this other perspective. But the view from an enslaved person's perspective is never acknowledged or recognized in this. So for all of this ability to see both sides of the argument, we never get to hear, of course, the perspective and voice of the enslaved person themselves. And in this sense, the Three-Fifths Compromise parallels the Southern position that suggested a reduced humanity of enslaved people. Many scholars interpret the Three-Fifths Compromise to mean that the founders viewed each individual slave or individual enslaved person as less than a full human. But in fact, when you really look at the Federalist 54, there is a direct quote in there. Paraphrasing the Southern position, Federalist 54 says that, quote, slaves are debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man, unquote. In other words, the interpretation here is that an enslaved person is only 2/5 less, or is 2/5 less than the full man or the full person. So there is a very strong suggestion there that just the full humanity of an enslaved person is not acknowledged. Now, whether they literally meant that or not, we don't know. But we know that the effect was that. We know that the effect was that enslaved people were not granted or acknowledged their full humanity. And so this is one of the troubling aspects of the original Constitution. It's hard to talk about. It's not something that I think we're particularly proud of when we look at this document, but we need to talk about it and acknowledge that it was there in the historical record. So what is the big picture of Federalist 54? The Federalist 54 indicates the following about the founders' thinking regarding counting the enslaved population. First of all, the founders were not simply unaware of the moral implications of slavery. Sometimes we hear that, this was a really bad thing, but they didn't really know. Back then, the thinking was different. They just simply weren't aware that there was, a moral issue, or they weren't thinking about it that way, and we shouldn't hold them accountable for that. Well, in fact, you can read this document. Its discussion suggests that they were very aware of the moral implications of slavery, and they themselves were conscious of it, and they were trying to make rhetorical arguments to address this issue in some way. We also know that they were ultimately willing to compromise core human rights values to solve political disputes during the framing of Constitution, that ultimately, even if there was some moral ambiguity or contradiction to democratic norms with the institution of slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise, they were willing to do that. They were willing to compromise principles of liberty in order to solve this political dispute between the regional factions at the Constitutional Convention. We know that this Three-Fifths Compromise about how to count the enslaved population did successfully navigate these disputes. It did allow the two factions to get together and agree to pass the Constitution. So it worked in a, you might say, political sense. But it exacted a huge moral cost, because now, we have this historical record of how this Three-Fifths Compromise was entered into the Constitution. It basically meant that there was an acknowledgement, a tacit protection of the institution of slavery, that it was being acknowledged, and that, again, as we've already said, the effect is that the full humanity of enslaved people was not acknowledged. The founders were also able to voice multiple views, right? They were able to see, okay, from one side of the aisle, this group of people is going to view the issue this way. From another side of the aisle, this group of people are going to view the issue this way. So in that sense, they were able to understand opposing multiple views. But the one view that was never brought in, or perspective that was never really brought in or given voice, is the perspective of the individual enslaved person. How does this Three-Fifths Compromise look to them? What does it say to them? How does it make them feel as a part of this republic? Clearly, there was no attempt to do that in this document. So this is a hard essay, I think, to reckon with, this Federalist 54, and the Three-Fifths Compromise is a difficult and painful part of the Constitution. It's important that we recognize it. It doesn't mean that we scrap the entire Constitution. It doesn't mean that we say the entire Constitution didn't have any value. But we have to be honest about how, at least in this early iteration, it failed to fully protect democratic norms for all people. And it failed to acknowledge the full humanity of large numbers of people in the United States. By passing the Three-Fifths Compromise, it did solve a political dilemma, but again, it exacted a moral cost. Luckily, we have had changes, of course, to the Constitution. We have the 13th Amendment now that has officially prohibited the institution of slavery. And by virtue of that, it's also prohibited the Three-Fifths Compromise. So the Three-Fifths Compromise, has been eradicated. The Constitution has been improved, largely because of the work of people like the abolitionists and the civil rights movement leaders, people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, that made sure that the Constitution really did live up to its promise for all citizens. So the improvements have been made, but it is important to acknowledge the historical record and reckon with some of these more concerning aspects that have come out in Federalist 54. Thank you for your time and attention.